This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Sarah Blair, and I've got two honored guests joining me today. Marlene Stimme is taking a break from her regular roundtable duties to chat with us, and we've also got our returning guest, artist X-File, JJ Lindell. Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey Sarah, it's going really well. Looking forward to this conversation with you guys.
So am I. Glad to be back.
It's going to be a good talk. So we are chatting about Milagro today, and it's a very layered episode. There's a lot to unpack here, I think. So, JJ, this is the first time you've ever seen this episode, right?
It's the first time I've ever seen the series. Yes, I'm new to the X-Files. It's it was interesting. It's I assume the show is about I guess they own that apartment building, and every episode's about a wacky tenant in the building that they have to cope with. Is that
That's
right?
close.
Yeah. And there's a murder.
You're not far off. Yeah, and there's
a murder in
mayhem.
every episode. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds exhausting.
Yeah. They've got a lot of investigating to do in this apartment building, but everything happens in the apartment building, so it's really a low budget show.
Yeah, it's like a play in every episode.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I had not seen this episode for quite a long time, and in fact, I know we had this on the books for a while that we were going to record this, and it wasn't until last night where I was like, okay, we're doing it in the morning. I haven't watched the episode again. I should probably do that. But I remembered a lot as I was making my way through. There weren't any surprises. It didn't end in a different way this time, so I felt good about my memory.
Marlene, this is your favorite episode, isn't it?
This is my favorite episode of The X-Files. And I've rewatched it. I haven't watched it in a little while because sometimes I like to just save it, and be a little bit surprised by it. Not by the content, but just the mood, the whole thing. And I was watching it yesterday. I was like, this is amazing. It's far and away my favorite episode.
That's why I love that X-Files is, even as many times as we've seen the episodes, there's still surprising things about it. Mm-hmm. I discovered a few things on this rewatch, too, that I hadn't known before. So we are definitely going to talk about those things, and I'm very excited. Let's do the stats here. So we're talking about Milagro. It's the 18th episode of Season 6, so we're getting towards the later half of Season 6. It originally aired on April 18th, 1999. It was written by Chris Carter with story by Frank Spotnitz and John Shiven, and it was directed by Kim Manners. And this is an interesting episode about a writer who's infatuated with Scully, and he moves in next door to Mulder and proceeds to slowly bewitch her through his writing. And Mulder investigates the man and realizes that he may be behind a series of killings that involve psychic surgery. And there's actually some other, there's a couple of episodes of, there's one episode of The Twilight Zone that this reminds me of, and there's one of Alfred Hitchcock episode, Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and they're both about writers who manifest their characters in real life. So that's pretty interesting. The Twilight Zone one is really cool because it's about this guy who is a playwright, and he records his words onto tape, and that brings the characters to life, and then he burns the tapes and they disappear. So the Twilight Zone part of it is that he has this wife, and she catches him talking to one of his characters, and she thinks that he's cheating on her. But then she doesn't believe him when he says that it's, all on tape and that they're just characters and they're not real. And so she throws one of the tapes in the fireplace and she starts to disappear.
Oh, that's cool.
It's
That's
really
really
cool.
interesting.
Yeah,
That
it's
one.
a good episode. It's the last
that's
episode
great.
of the first season. And
Cool.
it is called, I have the name of it here. What is it called? A World of His Own is the title of that episode. It's a good one. You should check it out. Yeah. So lots of tie-ins, because I kind of feel like as writers, we all sort of wish that our characters could be real sometimes. And sometimes maybe not, but yeah. So I checked out the IMDb score of this episode. You guys want to guess what you think it might be?
I'm going to guess it's maybe like around 7 would be my guess.
I'd go a little higher. I'd give it like a 8.5.
It is 7.9 out of 2,800 votes. Yeah, so it's on the sort of a lower end of the scale, but it's weird because season 6 is sort of all over the place as far as the IMDb ratings go. So, yeah, it's sort of middle of the road on season 6, actually.
I really like this episode, and like Marlene, I could see why it's your favorite. I absolutely can, but it's a different episode.
It is.
And I could see people not responding to it in the same way as others. So I could see why the rating wouldn't be super high, because it kind of breaks the formula a little bit, which for, big fans of the show, I think makes it even more appealing.
What would you rate it, JJ?
Watching it again, so when I don't watch the X-Files for a while, and then I watch an episode, it immediately puts me under its spell. And I'm always just floored by the production value. And I don't watch a ton of network drama, like, currently today. Usually I'll, like, catch it, in passing. And, like, I don't know of any network show that has it on the X-Files, which aired, 20 years ago, which is kind of crazy. But for this episode specifically, like, it's an incredible episode. It's a small story. There's not a ton of characters, but there's a ton of drama. It's beautifully written. It's beautifully shot. Like, I would definitely, like, for X-Files episodes, I would rate it higher than a 7.9. I would definitely rate it like an 8 or 9. But again, it's I think that the fact that the episode is told from a slightly different point of view than most of the other episodes, I could see it being a little polarizing for certain fans. And, you've got, I think anytime Mulder or Scully shows a romantic interest in a character other than Mulder and Scully, there are some fans that are like, nope, I'm not into that. And I would put that under this category.
What about you, Marlene?
I agree about everything JJ said about the production value and the writing and the directing and just the way that it's filmed, the way the music is used. And I love that it's kind of like it is an interior character piece. That's not a lot of like action and so forth. So it's different in that regard. And I like the themes, I like the writing themes. I like some of the religious and spiritual themes having to do with creativity. I think it sort of is a reflection of the whole show in a really wonderful way. A lot of allegory to Mulder and Scully in it. And then I really want to rate it a 10. I'm always think that nothing can quite get to be perfect, but enthusiasm wise I would say a 10. And after I watched it yesterday, I was like, this is just perfect. But like reality I would still go like a 9.9 because I think it is nearly perfect.
I would rate it like a high 8, like an 8.9 probably. It's one that I don't tend to rewatch a lot because I love it when I do watch it, but it's really scary to me because I think it hits a little close to home as far as being a writer and thinking about my characters so much and obsessing over my characters, and it's a very uncomfortable episode for me to watch because it does sort of hit close for me. But I do enjoy watching it. I think it's a very excellently, it's very well executed as far as, an episode goes. The writing is great, and I'm researching this one. I think it was Tony's interview with Frank Spotnitz. He mentioned that this was one of the ones that they tried to specifically have fewer locations and sets that were already built so that they could save some money on the budget. This was a low budget one. They tried to save money on this one, so they kept it with, Mulder's apartment and, redressed what they already had. So,
and Kim Manners talks about that in the, there's the commentary track that Kim Manners did over the episode that you can watch. And he talks about some of the prison scenes being filmed in a location that had been used for, like, other shows used it and built it. And so they basically just rented it from them. So it was a lot less expensive. So there's, a lot about keeping it lower budget, which I think with the X-Files, as much as some of their episodes cost, as much as they need a big budget for some of the, the big episodes, some of the ones that are lower budget, it really works because you really do have to rely on the characters to take you through the whole thing. So, it's not always a bad thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of, Chris Carter says this is one of his favorite episodes. He said that Sean Penn told him it was the best X-Files episode. And Frank Spotnitz says the same thing. And it's really interesting to hear his thoughts because this episode was his idea, Frank Spotnitz. And he said, I watched it's in one of the introductions on the DVDs for the special release DVDs. He says, after having worked on the X-Files for so many years and spending so much time thinking about these characters of Mulder and Scully, you do fall in love with them a bit. You do obsess about them. You find yourself thinking about them for hours and hours and hours, and that's what Milagro is about. It's about the power of that kind of obsession. So I think that's really interesting that he sort of came up with this show because of Mulder and Scully and or this episode, and tried to manifest his obsession about Mulder and Scully into this writer's obsession with Scully. And it's very meta, and there's a lot going on. So I can't wait to talk more about it. Should we dive in and get to it?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So, in our opening scene, we've got a writer, and he's just doing what writers do, which is staring out the window and picking away at his, well, for us, it's keyboards now instead of typewriters, but, he's got his cards up, and Frank Spotnitz said he put the cards up on the wall because that's how they break down all the episodes, and that's his handwriting up there on those cards and all of that. And I looked up, I hit pause because I wanted to know what the cards said. It's what do they say?
Yeah, because you can kind of see the one that has it was KN murders his own best intentions, and then the rest of them sort of go by in a blur.
Right. And we find out that KN is his character. It stands for his character. And so that's an interesting concept. Let's dig into that first, and then we'll talk about the poem. Is from Ezra Pound. It's from Canto. He's got 30 cantos. I think this one's Canto 1. But yeah, so KN murders his own best intentions. That's a spoiler alert for the rest of the episode, basically. Mm-hmm. How do you feel, Marlene, about him writing that down and then, manifesting his character to essentially, destroy him? Or it's very complicated, isn't it?
It is, because it's also, is it Ken Nascimento murdering his own best intentions, or is he, because he's just, later, this is jumping way ahead, but he says that he's just the tool, basically. And he says that Paget was, the tool of the truth and so forth, way at the end. But is it, Nascimento, or is it Philip Paget that's murdering his own best intentions? How conflated is he making himself with character at that point? So it's really interesting. And we don't know anything. He probably doesn't know at that point either how this is all going to come together. So I like that. I like that. It's, it's suggestive and creepy and interesting. And it's also a little bit affected in that sort of, that florid writer tone that he has throughout the episode. So it's a good start.
I really you've got the passage of time as he's sitting there and just with his cigarette and his typewriter. And I was thinking about when this aired, in 99. And like, even then the typewriter would have been a throwback. I mean, we see so many episodes of Scully typing on her huge like laptop and her desktop computer. So like it immediately paints a picture of this like sort of simplistic artist who is in his empty apartment with his chair and his typewriter. He's got his cards on the wall, and you know, he's immediately interesting, and like as a viewer, you're immediately taken with his story. And so, you know, I think it's a really strong opening. And, you know, in terms of, I guess we'll talk about this throughout the episode, but, you know, the dynamic between him and his creation is very ambiguous to me, even having seen this episode a number of times. And the idea of Ken as a real-world person, but then also as a work of fiction, those lines are really blurred for me. And so as we talk about the killer's motivations, it's hard for me to differentiate his motivations from Padgett's motivations, because I'm not entirely convinced that they're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I guess you could also speak throughout the episode as to like how culpable is Padgett for the actions of his creation, and is there even a difference between Ken's actions and his actions, especially as the plot continues and you know, there's a realization for the audience, and I assume for him, that the things that he's writing are coming to pass.
And I think it's really an interesting commentary on creativity. I mean, JJ, you're an artist, so like it's you know, how much of what artists create is part of them and part of like the actual art. Like how is that separate? How is it the same and how is it separate? It's really interesting to consider that, like
right.
you said, JJ, about, you know, his character and how much of the character is him.
Right.
And how much is it?
How much of it is trademark 20th Century Fox? And
because I mean, when you do create art, you have to like put some of yourself into it. It's your time and your energy,
right? And
like that transfer of energy and mental and physical toil that you put into it. So like every time an artist creates something, some of them is in it somehow, you know, whether it's completely just a made up thing or something that's based in reality.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, when I create a piece, I think that most artists or writers, like, you go to a different place, and, you know, when you're in that place, you're drawing from yourself, and it's about style and it's about energy and things like that. But, you know, when you, especially like creating something and then putting it out into the world for other people to see, you're, you know, disclosing a part of you that you wouldn't necessarily disclose in any other way. And that can be really intimidating. And I think throughout this episode, you see this character opening up, not just through his writing, but also through this very strange relationship that he starts to build with Scully. And so I feel like that, you know, that dynamic is sort of paralleled in that way too.
And then you've got that famous Hemingway quote where he says, "Writing is easy. All you have to do is open up a vein and bleed on the page," or something like that. And he like, and then Padgett literally pulls his own heart out. It's like,
right.
Big Hemingway fan.
Yeah,
clearly.
Exactly. He knows how to do it. He knows how to do this right.
Hemingway's
So, yeah.
not literally, man. Jeez.
Right.
It was a metaphor.
Right.
I think there's this really strong idea too, though, that in creating something, like he's and what he's doing, he's being very deterministic. Like, he's creating something, and, you know, I don't think he knows the end, but this idea that it's already determined by what he's writing. And like throughout the episode, and I would say this is sort of a common, really interesting X-Files theme, you have these interventions that come into play, and then including his own act at the end. You know, so I think that's an interesting part of art as well. I mean, I'm not a working artist, but I just, in the things that I've, you know, seen and heard from people and so forth, it's like, you know, not the idea of not knowing what your creation's going to do. And like JJ was talking about, and you were talking about, like, how responsible are you for that? But then also, like, how much of an end can you really predict, or is something else going to come in that can, exercise some sort of freedom and change that. I think that that's all very, very interesting. And it reminds me, like the other episode that kind of comes to mind a little bit, I was thinking about this, is Home Again.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, it was done to far, let's just say different effect, I would say. But, I mean, it's more over as well, like this idea that this creation, like he's not, he's claiming he's not responsible, that it took on this life of its own and so forth and behaved of its own will, which, Scully interestingly contrasts and contradicts at that point. But I thought that was, I don't know, I like it when the X-Files harkens back to previous things that they've done, and I feel like that was a case of that.
And even postmodern Prometheus too has ties in it, because it's like you're making this thing and it takes on a life of its own that you can't control. Yeah. And it, that's, as creators, you do your art and you have your own intentions for it, but then you put it out there and you can't control how the public reacts to it, if they're going to like it or how they're going to even interpret it. And if they're going to see what your intentions were, or if they're going to bring because everybody brings their own thing to it. And so they are automatically going to interpret it in their own way. And it's really interesting to see how he puts his own creation out into the world. And
that's something I think about a lot as a creator now, the idea of motivation and intent versus how people accept it in the public. And that has just become, at least for me, such a huge, much bigger part now with social media when you're sharing something out, because you create this thing, you put it out into the world, and now we have these numerous platforms for people to immediately react to it in whatever way they, whatever gut reaction they have, they can put that out into the world. And it is, I mean, that's scary. Like, and for me, when I'm creating something, especially like, let's say I create a piece for the X-Files. I mean, this show is really dear to tons of people. And, you want to make sure that you're being an ambassador for that, and, you're taking the creative work of other people and you're interpreting it, yourself. But, as an artist, part of what you have to do is sort of accept that your interpretation is not going to be for everyone. And, you've got to have a thick skin and you've got to be ready for criticism. And you've also got to be able to accept constructive criticism, but you've also got to be able to own your creation. And like when it comes to this episode, it's like Paget really seems to be struggling with ownership of the creation, especially later in the conversation that he has with it. But what's interesting, about this episode when it comes to like the creativity that he has is that he's taking a lot from the world around him, and specifically from Scully, and the idea of, creating characters out of thin air, or what he's doing, which is being like greatly inspired by these people that he encounters in his own world, to the point of obsession, which I think is another theme in the episode, the idea of obsession. And, I think that, anytime I watch something that is this old, this came out in 1999, I do think about those kind of dynamics now, and like, how does this play today? Because we live in a completely different world when it comes to the ideas of, obsession. And, this episode plays a lot with the male gaze, which we'll get to. So I'm interested to think about that as well.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you said that Philip Paget takes a lot from the world around him, because he's out in the world. I mean, he's obviously having to go out to see Scully in these different places and so forth. But then he's living, it's not just an aesthetic, like there's nothing else going on. Note cards are the only decoration in his apartment. And I think that, and then like you see think about the window and the way the light comes in the teaser, and he just has some curtains kind of thrown up there without any sort of, like design or anything. It's just very, very like sub-functional almost, and he tells Scully later on, like he has what he needs and he really lives in his head and so forth. And I think there's a strong contrast to there's a comparison for sure, but also a strong contrast to Mulder, even going from scenes in Paget's apartment to scenes in Mulder's apartment, because you see like he's what was it that Scully said in season 4? She was talking about people that lead Spartan lives, and she was comparing him to Max Finnick, and like these men that have these singular passions and they lead these Spartan lives. But I think this episode shows that Mulder isn't really completely like that. Like, you see that Paget is, so you see a difference there. Like, Mulder has an apartment that's put together, and he does have some decoration, and he may be obsessed, but it's not, to the degree or in that same sort of almost, I don't want to say, it's not, Paget's obsession isn't inhuman, but it's just, it doesn't have the humanity that Mulder's does. And I think that that's really like a really well done way of playing it in this episode, and even the physical contrast between them and their living spaces and so forth too. So I don't know. I think the teaser is, I think it's great in showing, just like the watching and showing the apartment and Philip Paget moving through it over time. But you just also see a lot of like where he lives, and the nothingness of that, even though he is out in the world, it seems like there's nothing. I wonder what he's receiving, like energy-wise, to like refill himself creatively, I guess is the thing. Because he's just sitting there like hammering away, from the very beginning at the typewriter. And I think people that are trying to do some kind of creative work have to have some sort of way to like refill themselves, and it doesn't seem like he has that. So.
Well, I think that it's Scully, like, and whatever strange supernatural connection that he has, which again is very ambiguous to me, like whatever's connecting him to these killings and everything like that. You say all that, and then it just makes me think, wow, Scully really has a type, doesn't she?
I mean, they are very similar.
Yes.
Yeah, she has a little
really
bit of that
does.
herself. Yeah.
Yeah. And like what you said about, Mulder, and he's got his fish, at least. He's got something he can take care of. So,
Right.
Yeah, sweet Mulder. Let's talk a little bit about, Paget's obsession with Scully, because I think it is an obsession. And I want to talk a little bit about, the difference between having a muse and something that inspires you and being obsessed with a person, because I think there's definitely a difference.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I think his is definitely more obsession than inspiration.
I'm curious to get your perspectives as women, because I watch these scenes. I watch the scene in the elevator where he's staring at her. I see these interactions, and they make me really uncomfortable. I think that they cast this character really well, because John Hawkes brings like this, kind of quiet, calm dignity to the role that I think could have been a lot more off-putting if put in another actor's hands. And so I think that he helps to sell this, but then, you look at it on the page and you sort of, actually focus on his actions, and, this guy has relocated himself to be close to this woman. He's listening through air vents. He's, spending his days in solitude writing, trying to get into her head. It's, I mean, to me, I find it very, very scary. But what we have to go off of in the episode isn't just that, it's the way that Scully reacts to it. And I think what surprises me about the episode and what makes it so layered is, Scully's reaction is not, immediate alarm bells. She is, for some reason, taken with this fixation. And so, but I guess I'm just curious to hear what you folks have to say about that, and how it made you feel, the first time you saw it, or just, the most recent watch.
Well, I think so. The elevator scene, I think, is interesting. Again, like the way it's filmed, they show him many times in the episode, but I noticed it most in that first elevator scene when he has that sort of lighting that covers like the whole, his entire right side of his face is black, like his eyes dark and so forth. And then Scully is brighter, and of course they show the close-ups of her lips and so forth, and him looking at her, like clearly gazing at her. And this time when I watched it, and she's, like you said, she's uncomfortable. You see her kind of walking uncomfortably down the hall to Mulder's apartment after they get off the elevator. But then I noticed in the scene when Mulder later is in the elevator with Paget after he steals his mail, and they're going up. Paget, I'd have to really like compare them side by side, but I don't know that he's looking at, I mean, I think the intent is different, but I don't know that he's looking at Mulder any differently than he looked at Scully. Like he's very openly staring at him, and Mulder's kind of looking away. And then when they walk down the hall, I don't know, Mulder seemed to have like sort of the same posture. It's filmed in the same way, like blocked in the same way as when Scully was walking down the hall in the first scene. So I'm wondering if some of the difference isn't in the camera work and those close-ups and showing Scully's reaction and like showing her lips and her eye and so forth, because I don't know that Paget's behavior changed between those two scenes. Like I think they're very parallel scenes. So I think it's the way his gaze is interpreted, because that's the thing about him that's interesting is, and like you said, like the way that John Hawkes does this, it's not like he's just some psychopath that's openly staring at people, you know, with a blind stare. But at the same time, like he's not averting his eyes. He's really staring at them, at either one of them at either time. In terms of just like feeling like frightened or the creepiness, I think to me it's the scene when Scully goes to his apartment and he's telling her how he had noticed her in his old, or she lived in his old neighborhood and he'd noticed her, and that there was nothing available in her building, and so he had gotten, you know, this apartment in Mulder's building. So he clearly knows her patterns and, you know, that she's not home very much and all of those things. And so it was thinking about that and her reaction to that I thought really was the creepier part of it, I guess. I don't know. I might have more on that, but that's my feeling so far. And I to me, like, it's a little bit surprising, but also not surprising that Scully is a bit taken with that, I think.
Well, I think it's interesting to note that, you know, when he is writing Dana Scully. He's not using her as a muse. Like, you know, he is specifically following Scully. He is learning her habits. He's learning everything about her. He's using her name in his book. You know, it's a very different dynamic, and I think that's a little bit where the creepiness eases in there, because he's treating her, this real person, and writing her as this character.
Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to create Scully, but Scully is already Scully. And
exactly.
I guess the big thing that I have always noticed about this episode is that he has a lot of facts correct, and that alarms her. Mm-hmm. You know, she talks about his audacity and so forth. But at the end, like, you realize he really does not know her, and like knowing a lot of things about somebody, or even being able to predict certain things, doesn't mean that he really knows who she is, and following her around and so forth doesn't mean that he like knows her interior, you know. So I do think it's more an obsession than an inspiration.
Yeah. And like you know, as a writer, you take things from reality that you experience, but then you twist them and make them into your own fictional thing. And I think, you know, that's natural and normal as a writer, to be inspired by like a real person, but then my characters are my own characters. They come into my head, and, you know, they're completely separate. They look like people in the real world because sometimes I just need something to like start with. But as characters, they have their own experiences, they have their own things, and they're completely separate. But, you know, I think that's an important distinction that he does not make.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's sort of like the first part of the episode. There's a lot of ambiguity for me in that relationship, and not just between Paget and, you know, the stranger, you know, Ken, this killer. You know, the idea of, you know, is what Ken is doing driving the plot of Paget's book, or is what Paget is writing driving the actions of Ken, you know, or is it somewhere in between? But then when you apply that to Scully, who he is super focused on, you know, for a time in the episode, you know, I think a viewer can think like, is he somehow through his writing motivating these thoughts in Scully through some sort of, again, like psychic or supernatural occurrence? But there's that moment during the interrogation with Mulder where, you know, Mulder's, you know, being the tough guy, and he's moving in because, you know, Paget's giving him some sass, and, you know, Scully just sort of steps in between gently, you know, Mulder, and you just see this realization on Paget's face, like, oh, this I did not know. And for me, that's the moment in the episode where it's like, oh, he's not driving what she's doing, because he missed, the elephant in the room, which is that this woman that he's been obsessed with is in love with Mulder, and he just didn't see it. And it's not something that he can change. And, I feel like that moment for him, like, his entire sort of like patchwork that he had put together in his mind of how things were going to go fell apart. So yeah, no, it's interesting to hear the perspective on, I guess I would call the creepy factor of the episode. And, with the, I do like those scenes in the elevator for me are very parallel scenes as well. And it's tough because I don't know that John Hawkes is doing much different in terms of the way that he's like, staring at Scully in one scene and in Mulder in the other scene. But for me, that goes to the intent of, the director and the writers. And, it chooses to, the episode chooses to show you sort of these shots in the scene with Scully of her lips and so of his reacting. And for me as the viewer, that does send a very different vibe in that scene than it does with the scene with Mulder, because of the way it's shot. And that, for me, it's about intent for the episode. Like, we interact with film in, it's very much a one-way street. Like, when you read a book, you have the words and you can sort of create the images in your mind. But when you're watching a film or a television show, I mean, the director, the writers, the creatives behind it, they have a lot more sway as to how you interpret actions by what they choose to point the camera at. And when it comes to film, that, for me, that's the artistry of it. It's the photography and the editing. And for me, the scene with Mulder and Paget, it played more hostile than the scene with Paget and Scully. That, for me, that was a moment where it's almost like, oh, this is the closest I've been to my obsession. This is the longest I've been able to see her, and she's seeing me. And when he's in the elevator with Mulder, for me, it's almost like Scully is in there with them, because it's the thing that's between them. And even with all this, this case that's going on, I mean, that this is, Scully is foremost on Paget's mind and is likely foremost on Mulder's mind. Yeah, it's such an interesting episode, because it is very much about this writer and this, sort of monster of the week plot. But man, does this delve deep into the relationship between Mulder and Scully and what is going on with them. And that's what I love so much about the show, is that, even though it was created in an era where it was just sort of like, okay, episodic, week to week to week, we might be able to mix in some overarching themes throughout the show. But man, it does such a great job of building sort of that constant pressure on their relationship and the status of it, and what do they mean to one another, and where is this going, and how does this affect where they're going in the future. And I feel like this is such a great episode when it comes to sort of like, you have the overarching alien mythology, and then you have the overarching like Mulder Scully mythology. And I feel like this is such a like pinnacle episode when it comes to that storyline.
I do too. I think there's also this idea, like, does it have to be a certain type of relationship? Like, because Paget has this one idea in his mind, I think, of what love is, and he talks about like he wanted to love Scully, and it's very specific, I think, and very obvious what he means by that. But I think that there's also this, this idea throughout from his writing and from just Scully's, comportment of, does she, like, would she want to have, like, not like necessarily Paget, but like what does she have? Like, what is the nature of love in general? And also, like, when, the part when Paget says Agent Scully is already in love, like, well, what does that mean? Does it mean like what we think it usually means on TV shows and movies and so forth? Or could it mean something different? And there was an interview that I think it was John Scheiben did when he talked about that. Like, Scully is kind of thinking about, like, realizing, like, through Paget, like, maybe she already has love. It's just not the sort of marriage or family or traditional, this type of thing, So I like that there's room for that sort of interpretation in it. And I also think that the episode, the ending is a catharsis, I think, but I think it's not just from that episode. I think it really is, I don't know, season 6, to me, it's, it's like X-Files light in a way, but I think it's also just the unease under the surface of everything, going back at least probably like to season 5, certainly since the movie. And I think that part, in the graveyard when Scully reads the voiceover that I'm sure we'll talk about later on if we stop skipping around. It talks about it's the episode just makes you do that, I think, but how love can become hate. And it's like that, it's a lot of what she's describing in that writing is the story, I think, of their relationship in this season. And so then when you get to the ending, it's almost like a breakthrough of all of what's happened before. So yeah, I like it. I really like the episode for that reason too, because I think it addresses their relationship in a way that's very different from what you might expect from a TV show or even from the X-Files,
Let's talk a little bit about the pendant that he sends her, because I think that's an important part. He drops it off at the FBI building, and they can't get a good ID on him in the FBI building.
He was average looking, they say.
He was average looking. You don't remember. You walk into the FBI building and nobody can ID you, which is hilarious. But, the X-Files, there you go.
Right. No hair color, no.
Yeah. Just, completely just very average looking person walks into the FBI and leaves somebody an anonymous package.
Right.
For an
just slip it under
and
their
they
door.
and they just slip it under the door. They're like, oh, this is for Mulder. Okay, here you go.
He's never.
I know they didn't
Balloon
just
in the
let him
basement, sure.
Before.
Yeah. Oh, you want to just walk down and slip somebody something under their door? Sure, go ahead. No big deal.
My gosh.
Completely average-looking stranger person.
Right.
But Scully says it's called a milagro. It's a Spanish word for a miracle, and it's worn as a lucky charm. So he gives her this quote, quote, lucky charm, and it's a burning heart, which, when you think burning heart, you think strong passion, feelings of, maybe desire, just very, fiery, passionate feelings brings to mind. And, she's already, I think, is this already before or after they've gone to she goes to the church after this.
Based on that.
Yeah, based on that. So she recognizes that, and then she takes this charm to the church. But, if she's interpreting it as a lucky charm, do you think, he's giving this to her? I mean, obviously he's giving it to her as a clue because he wants her to know that it's him eventually. But do you think he is giving it to her as, a talisman or
is he giving it to her so she'll go to the
send
church?
Her, yeah.
I don't know.
I think
I see it as I think it's a
several
manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a certain amount of manipulation going on there. As he basically says when he gets to the church and lays it out for her and says, I know that you are in this neighborhood often, even though you don't live here. I know that you can park anywhere because of your government ID. I noticed that you wear a chain around
calves.
Yes. Can I talk about your muscular calves for a moment? I don't see how that's relevant to this, but sure. But, he's just like, here's all the research that I've been doing on you. So I thought if I were to slip this to you. Yeah, it's so interesting the way that he, and again, I think it speaks a lot to John Hawkes' performance, where he makes it all seem so, mundane. I couldn't get a room in your building, so I chose your partners, and and I noticed this and this and this, and it's all just research for my book. And so I thought that if I were to slip you this charm, that you might think of this place, and you would come and see it, and then I would be here, and here we are. It all worked out. And again, it's a moment for me where I'm trying to figure out as a viewer, is this guy, is he manipulating her on a level that's supernatural? Or has he just really sort of done his homework and has found a way to sort of manipulate her on just more of a psychological level to be at this place? And by the end of the episode, I think it is the latter, but it's certainly at that point that, especially given the main plot of what's going on, it's what kind of sway does this guy have over Scully? Is she in control of her own actions at this moment? But I do think the charm is, it's so interesting because like you could view this guy in very different ways. You could see him as this sort of like genuine, lovelorn, kind of awkward writer, or you could see it as like this guy is manipulative and you know, how much is he seeing Scully for Scully, or does he feel like he has some sort of ownership over her as if she were just one of his characters in his book? And I don't know that answer is fully, you know, revealed in the episode. I think it might be somewhat up to the interpretation of the viewer, but you know, I did see it as more of a manipulation.
I think he definitely is manipulating her to get to the church, and that he does think that that he knows her and she's this character that he's creating. But there's something that's very sincere in his intent. And it's like you said, he's just like, okay, yeah, I set this up so that we would show up here. Like, he's not trying to camouflage either what he's doing or his supposed feelings for her. And I think that whatever honesty is there is appealing to her. I think that's part of the draw, is that he's so, in some ways, very transparent about what he's doing.
It's got to be very different for her compared to Mulder, who I feel like, I don't know. It's you, when you think about it that way, you can see the attraction for her, because even though these two characters are similar, like in the ways that you pointed out, like Mulder and Paget, like it's almost like Paget is like an extreme version of Mulder when it comes to his obsession and focus and you know, single will, but you know, Paget is just so like, hey, I think you're beautiful and all these things, and like is just giving her this different type of attention. And then in the episode itself, you know, it's juxtaposed to Mulder being like, hey, I set your schedule for you and you're going to do this thing at this time.
Right.
And, you know, Scully's like, you know, thanks for making my schedule for me, but I'm going to be late for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Mulder's just sort of like, you know, it lingers on Mulder at the end of that scene. Like,
yeah.
like, what was that about?
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, I you know, I think that, you know, the writers are, I mean, they're doing that very purposefully just to try and, you'll have these episodes where, you know, Scully is sort of like taken out of her routine and she's starting to notice things about Mulder that, in certain episodes she doesn't, that Mulder is just sort of this like really, he can be very dismissive and bossy and single-minded, and sometimes Scully's just sort of like, why do I put up with you? Like, what? Why?
Right.
You know.
I think we all are a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. And it makes the audience, you know, think about that too, because sometimes we can just, oh, you know, they're partners, they're going on their adventures, there's spooky stuff happening, and then sometimes the show really flips the script on you and forces you to focus on the fact that, you know, why does, you know, Mulder such a jerk sometimes? Like, why is he interacting with her like this? She's given him everything. And I, you know, and that's another reason why I appreciate that episode, because I like when the show does that. I like when it forces you to think about this relationship in a different way.
Mm-hmm. I do too. I think, I mean, again, though, I think Mulder at the end, you know, like he really does know her, even though he's not noticing these details and not sort of responding to her in the way that Paget is and so forth. And I think another interesting thing I think about this episode is that, like, as deeply personal as it is and as many emotional things that are going on, like, they still have to work. You know, there's one scene, I think it cuts from, it may be the voiceover from the graveyard, like very emotional, you know, very interior sort of scene. And then they're at the graveyard and they're working. And it's like they have to kind of keep this up because that's what they do. And that's the context in which they know each other, you know. But it's just, I don't know. I think that's interesting, that, like, the juxtaposition of, like, they have to have this work life. And then they also have all these other sort of things, you know, undercurrents under the surface that are going on.
And, I mean, I think it's fair to call this, like, a manipulation that he gives us to her and everything. And it's very Sherlock Holmes, isn't it? Where, like, it's almost like something Sherlock Holmes would pull to, like, trap one of the criminals or something. Mm. Yeah. But it's not weird when he does it. It's cool when Sherlock Holmes does it. But, you know, and then Scully goes on to say that, you know, it's insignificant. It's not, it doesn't matter. And Mulder is like, actually, I think it matters a lot. And she's like, no, it's just this guy with a weird obsession, and he's kind of frightening. And
He's like Sherlock Holmes. That's it.
yeah.
Remember that scene when Sherlock Holmes is like, Moriarty, you have such strong calves.
Exactly.
Oh.
I noticed you wear a cross
Thank
around
you.
your neck.
And and I love those scenes because they play out so often where, like, you know, Mulder and Scully are talking and Mulder's like, I think it's this way, and Scully's like, no, you're wrong, it's this way. And then later it's like, Scully's like, listen, you were right, it was the way you said. And Mulder's like, no,
I don't think so.
it was what you said. Wait, what? Oh man, we could have like cut a whole act from this episode if we would have just. Right, you're still wrong. Why do I still have to be wrong?
Every time.
He's like, actually, let's switch places because this is where I'm usually, you know.
Right.
In the hallway.
Yeah, they
You might as
physically do
well
it in the episode. I thought that was a great bit. That
great.
was just, yeah.
Yeah.
too.
I like that they know each other so. And that's the thing is, like, Mulder and Scully do know each other so well.
Exactly.
And yeah, it's just layers upon layers upon layers, right? So good. Let's talk about the scene at when they're interrogating him in the church. Yes? Or not the church, the prison.
the
Sorry.
jail.
I was like, oh, I
When he's
missed
in the
that
jail.
scene.
Sorry. No.
It's like, was that
Mulder's
really-
like, we're going to take him to the church to interrogate him because we can't afford another set.
and that church
We're going to
is
spend a
adjacent
lot
to
of
the-
money on the unnatural.
the church is adjacent to the graveyard that's adjacent to the apartment, I'm sure. as
Yeah,
well.
all of the buildings
That's
are right
right.
next to each other.
Okay, so the scene, the prison interrogation room, Mulder's questioning Philip Paget, and Mulder shows him one of the newspapers with the Circle personal ad. And this is where Scully touches him, right? And so
Yes,
Mulder
this is the
wait,
scene
yeah.
where he gets a little hot-headed with the cool and collected Paget, who's like giving these like enigmatic answers
About
and
Right.
Jungian
yeah,
interpretations of literature.
Yes. And he totally notices Scully, you know, grabbing Mulder's hand and
Yes.
telling him to wait. It's
Yeah.
like really
Yeah.
intense, isn't it?
absolutely.
Well,
And
it's not, it's intense for him. It doesn't seem intense
Yeah.
between them. It's just a moment that they would have. But
Right.
It's intense realization for him, I think.
yeah, and
Yeah.
thus it's intense for us as the audience member because we are seeing a realization in this character that we've been tracking through the episode. It's funny because like we don't, Mulder can be kind of like, he can lose his cool, but we don't see him lose it that often, or at least in that particular kind of way, because it was almost like this guy was being Mulder at Mulder. Like,
Yeah.
you could tell he's like, I don't like this.
When somebody answers a question with a question, or,
Right.
does it...
Scully, can you imagine someone being like this all the time? Scully's just like, yes. I
Yes.
can.
When I ask you where you're going and you say you're off to water the seeds of doubt, like, this is exactly what this guy's doing.
What part of town is that? I like the scene a lot because of that moment, and because I felt like, for me, it answered that question. That moment answered the question about, what is the nature of Paget's hold over Scully? Is there something more going on here? Is it supernatural? Is it connected to this psychic, murderer? But this is where sort of the rug gets a little pulled out from under this guy's fantasy of the Scully of his book versus the Scully that's in this room, gently handling her partner in a way that he would not have manifested in his mind when he was writing this character. And so that moment really worked for me. I also like the fact that we get to see Mulder do some like actual investigation connected to this scene. He like actually finds the real world connection between these victims and the fact that they all had personal ads taken out, which is something we don't always see.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. He notices that, like, when in the DC Muse, and then looking in the personal ads too. And it's interesting too, because like all of that is done. I know it's not the same thing as like writing, but it's done on paper. Like there's just this emphasis on these very material things. I think kind of old fashioned material, or probably
That's
not.
why
for
they put the I in the
1999.
FBI.
Still, yeah.
Right.
Yes, and I like the line where Paget says Jungians would say it's the characters who choose the writer, not the other way around. So I guess you could argue that he directed me. So he's not really even denying that he's involved with this somehow. He just,
Yeah. He's not taking it
but
as
they
reality.
don't have
I don't
evidence. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, that there seems to be like, this disconnect for me. They create this very sympathetic character, and like we talked about, I think a lot of that has to do with John Hawkes' performance as the character. But there's also this strange disconnect. You could see if this was a different person who maybe had sort of like a stronger ethos or like more of a moral compass, the idea that the writing that he's doing is somehow connected to these real world murders might have been chilling and affecting and would stop him in his tracks, but absolutely not. Like, that is not what we get from this character. It's very much a person who is laser focused on finishing this work. And the work is just so connected to Scully and his obsession with her. It just, I don't think that the ethical quandary here even comes into his mind, at least at this point in the plot, until it's affecting something that matters to him.
Yeah.
Scully.
Right. I agree. I think he's completely self-absorbed. And at this point, I would say until the end, like his obsession with her and what he thinks is his love for her is just more of his self-absorption. And he thinks that he's either, like you were talking about, like you wonder if he's causing this and creating it, and then in the prison scene, he makes it sound like he's just merely taking dictation of what's happening.
Right.
And so it's not something that he has any control over, but he's completely unconcerned that it's resulting in people dying. I mean, I don't think that he's even, I just don't think it enters his realm of thought, because he's just absorbed with his image of Scully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
And I
see the
think-
episode going in a different direction. Them trying to, get him to acknowledge the real world consequences of his actions, but it doesn't go there. The episode doesn't seem super interested in it.
The part like that JJ was talking about when Scully touches Mulder's arm and Padgett has this realization, it kind of cuts off this idea that he's merely taking dictation, I think, too, because he certainly didn't see that.
Yeah.
And then, with the real world consequences, Mulder finds the body in the truck of this young lady who's been murdered.
Yeah, after accosting
real
a
world.
poor groundskeeper.
Yes.
Chasing him down.
He didn't know.
Everyone who wears a hoodie is a murderer. No, Mulder, that's not true.
Can you imagine him, Mulder, in like today's world with people with hoodies? He'd be like chasing down every second person he saw.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. Yeah, I think that Mulder, I don't think
him.
that Mulder would do well in
And pizza
in
delivery
2020.
boys, too.
Yeah, right. He just keeps stabbing them through the heart.
Just, why? Mulder, he was drugged. So then we get back to them questioning Padgett, or Scully asks Mulder, how he knew that the body was in the truck. He's like, I imagined it. It would not be the first time Mulder makes a literal leap to conclusion about where something is.
That's such an antagonistic moment for me of him towards Scully, because like he can tell that she has a soft spot or some sort of complicated feelings, and we have skipped over, I believe, the scene where Scully goes into the apartment. Have we not?
We skipped that and the conversation in the jail after they interrogate Padgett. But yeah, the one when it's Padgett supposedly writing it, or we don't quite know if it's Padgett writing it, that she comes to his apartment. And he has coffee and they talk about loneliness.
That's an important scene.
Yeah.
The episode lives in that scene for me because we have Scully sort of is giving in to this fascination with this guy, and it's a guy that on some level she has to know is if not dangerous, perhaps there's something unsavory going on with this guy. And we see her taking these sort of like baby steps into his apartment and into his bedroom and onto his bed. Like literally, Dana Scully is sitting on this stranger's bed with him. My question is, if Mulder doesn't bust the door down with his gun drawn, does Padgett's fantasy come true of him becoming intimate with her on the bed?
See, that's something I thought about as well. And there's this idea like, that the story is interrupted by Mulder coming in, or that Mulder is somehow intervening, even though that wasn't in Paget's original story. So I would say no, because I don't think it's that determined. Mm-hmm. And I don't think her behavior and her are as determined as Paget wants to see her. But he obviously is perceiving something in her, because some of what he's saying is accurate. You know, like we talked about, like what he said in the church about her, you know, her parking and her calves and all these things.
Right.
But I don't, like, again, like going to the end point, I think that I think that parallel scene wise, the scene that he's writing that he sees of her, like with them, you know, making out on the bed, is sort of its opposite is the end of the episode when Mulder's holding Scully. And so that's the real ending, you know. And Paget has this whole thing, like you see on the typewriter, like how will it end? And he talks in the voiceover at the end about a story can have only one true ending, you know. So I like that idea that those are sort of parallel but opposite scenes. And I don't think if Mulder had come in, I don't know. I don't think it would have happened. I don't know what would have happened though. Maybe the scene just wouldn't have existed. I don't know.
I would have liked to think that Scully would be self-possessed enough to be in control over that and to, you know, draw the line. Because I think she is intrigued, and I think her investigator's mind, she wants to keep going, and she wants to know more about, you know, what he's thinking. Because she is somewhat, I mean, she doesn't have the degree in psychology from Oxford that Mulder has, but she still has to have profiling skills. And she still has to be able to get inside a killer's head and to know, you know, what they're thinking. And I think that's really intriguing for her, too. Because while she continues to insist that this guy is only obsessed with her and he's not really their killer, you know, she's still intrigued by him and still wants to know maybe why he has this obsession over her. And I would like to think that, you know, like he says, you have a gun. So,
right.
You know,
right, but
he does acknowledge that.
I think that's interesting too, though, because he's like, why? She says that she's very uncomfortable with this, and he's like, "Why you're armed?" It's like I don't know that she's physically afraid that he's going to attack her or something of that sort.
Right.
So I don't know. That to me seems I don't want to say manipulative, because I'm not sure it was outright manipulative, but that's not the fear that she's talking about, for one thing. And I love his line when she asks, like, why am I staying here? Like, if you know me so well, why am I staying when my instincts are telling me to go? And he says that motivation is never easy. Sometimes it occurs to one only later. And I think when I first saw that, like, I had not thought about that in my life, you know, being true. But I was like, that is actually pretty accurate. You know, like life lessons learned from the X-Files. But I think that that's kind of a crux of that scene, too. Like, she doesn't quite know why she's doing this. And so you don't quite know how it's going to end, because she's not sure, like, what the motivation is for this anyway, you know?
Yeah, and it definitely connects to the conversation that he overhears through the vent between Mulder and Scully, where she's talking about motivation of a killer.
Oh, yeah, you know, find the motive, you find the murderer. Right. Yeah.
She's like, it can be a perfect crime, there could be no evidence, but a killer will always be given away by their motive. And if you could find a good motive for a killer, then you'll find that killer. So I loved how those two ideas connected. The idea of motivation for, you know, staying on the bed, and the idea of motivation for committing a heinous act. I don't know. I hear what you guys are saying, but I think he had her number. I do. She seems so intrigued, and there are just things happening in that scene that, you know, the lamp, the bulb busting, and him changing it, and him sitting, and it lighting again. It's just like it has these, I don't know, meet cute kind of elements to it, and she just seems to be
cups, the mismatched coffee cups.
I know, yeah. And he's just, I mean, like, he's sort of saying all the right things for the moment, and he is being very disarming in, I think, what seems to be like a really effective way, because she's sitting on this bed, like, thigh to thigh with him. Yeah. And I just think that, like, and again, coming off of, you know, what her and Mulder just talked about, they had just had that conversation that they always have, where it's like, well, Mulder, you were right. No, you were right, which means that I'm right. But she, you know, she doesn't buy it. I don't think she goes into that. I don't think she buys that he's the killer. I think that she still thinks that this is about her, and I think she is, much like the narration that he's creating, her inner thoughts. Like, I think that at this point, he's really he's really accurate as to where her head is. I think this mysterious, attractive guy has shown this interest in her, and I don't think she sees him as a threat, and I don't know that she particularly sees, her going in there as a work-related investigation. I think that it, in her mind, is this weird detour that she's going on. And I think that's what makes her feel conflicted. And, she's sitting on that bed with this strange guy who has already made his intentions clear. And she knows that on the other side of the wall is Mulder, waiting for her. And I don't know, there's such energy in that scene.
Yeah, and there's the line in the part when it's the fantasy when Paget's writing it. It ends with, what would her partner think of her? Right.
And it's so... That thought is, I think, so central to that scene, because I think every action she takes in that scene that brings her closer to him, you can tell that in the back of her mind, she's thinking about that. Not just should I be doing this, but what would Mulder think if he saw me doing this? And then, of course, the worst case scenario comes through, and Mulder literally bursts through the door and catches them on the bed together. And I think that moment, it defines everything that Mulder does after in the episode. Because it's not just about this guy possibly being the killer. This is the guy that I caught Scully on the bed with.
Yeah.
But
it clearly, in the book, Mulder didn't come into the room, in his original writing of it. So there is something at that point that's changed in the narrative.
Sure. Again, and I guess I'm just a little ambiguous as to that scene in the book, as to whether the scene in the book was literal, or the scene in the book was a scene of the stranger fantasizing about the scene. Does that make any sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
But then also there's the part in the prison, in the scene that we haven't really discussed yet, when Mulder is saying that, what was it? If he imagines the murders, or imagines what someone's going to do, it's a priori. And he says, I think that's pretty clear from what he wrote about you. So he sort of has this absolute faith that this did not happen.
Right.
That she did, yeah.
Right. Well, but that moment, and that is something that comes up a couple of times in their conversation, where Mulder's Scully's like, well, maybe he can just predict. And it's just he's like, well, you saw what he wrote about you. I mean, he wasn't in your head, was he? And you can tell, her lips are saying, no, of course not. But he was. I think that the way that Gillian Anderson delivers those lines, it's very clear that he was in her head. And all the things that Mulder wants her to say no. Mulder wants her to say, no, of course, I don't have any romantic inclinations toward this man. Everything that he's writing is insane. But that's not the case. And sort of, they're just playing this fiction out between them so that they can stay in these really specific roles that they've created for each other. And this guy is really messing with their dynamic in a way that I don't think either of them really want to acknowledge. And I think that affects both of their actions for the rest of the episode and how they deal with the case and with him as a character.
Mm-hmm. I like, too, when she says that, I think you know me better than that, Mulder. And she's kind of averting her eyes and looking away. And I think that he does know her better than that. She is correct about that. But then, like you said, in that moment, he doesn't quite know what was in her head.
Yeah, she's lying. And she's lying to him.
But I think it's true overall that he does know her better than that. As a person in general. Mm-hmm. But maybe in that moment, it's she is hiding this.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. They know each other well.
Them, yes, but I also think the look that he gives her back, it's kind of I think that he realizes yes, you're right. But there's that moment when he's just and then he's okay, I do. So it's just that's interesting.
I don't know. It's I when I think about this episode, I think about what happens if he doesn't come in, because I think it's the not knowing that's interesting, because it's easy to say, oh, she wouldn't do it because, it's Scully. She wouldn't do that. But does she know, you talk about how well does Mulder know Scully. Well, how well does Scully know Scully in that moment?
Right. Right. And that's what Paget was writing about her as well.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Having her question herself, too, is really interesting.
It is.
When she has those moments. And it's not the only episode where she does that,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that ties back to Never Again as well, in a way. Although I find that
absolutely
a darker example.
Yeah, it's kind of like a trilogy of episodes in my mind, with Never Again, Milagro, and All Things. They're these really sort of intense Scully-centric character piece episodes that, involve... There's a lot of sort of, like, religious, spiritualist, overarching tones to them. And, it's interesting to think of those three in particular as being sort of, like, somehow connected.
Yes.
So the end of that scene, he arrests Paget. Mulder does. And then we get to this scene that we talked about just before that.
I also, in the scene, like, is there a chance that Mulder would not come in and intervene? And I don't mean, like, in a writing way, in a determined way, but is there a chance that Mulder wouldn't make that choice? That's another thing.
In terms of, like, hearing...
Once he finds out what's going on, and he, I guess, figures out she's there, yes. I don't see a world, an ending in which he wouldn't come over and think he's rescuing her,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Right.
Like, which is what makes that moment so shocking for him.
Yeah.
Because he expects to, like, see, Donnie Pfister, like, over her body or something like that. But they're just sitting, staring into each other's eyes on his bed. It's just like, wait, this isn't the book I wrote. Like, this is not in my script. What is going on here? And, and, Mulder is, in the next scene, the way that he's interacting with him.
Or did he know she was there? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but he's going over there because he's figured out this case. Does he even know that she's there? I guess
I think it's the same. It's the same way that Paget was able to spy on Mulder and Scully. I think that he hears her. Heard her there, and then just goes into agent mode and busts the door down. But Mulder's he's kind of on edge for the rest of the episode. Mm-hmm. He's a hothead in the interrogation scene in the police department after that. And then he's sort of making a lot of these kind of leaps in the graveyard scene when he manhandles the groundskeeper and then leaps into the back of the flower truck. And then when he makes a very antagonistic comment to Scully after that, when she asks, "How did you know that the body would be in the trunk?" And he just kind of, it's almost like a jab. It's like, I'm going to use your boyfriend's words against you because, I imagined it. It's like, ooh, meow.
Yeah.
So after they release Paget, he goes back to his apartment. And there's the line right before that. He says, "In my book, I'd written that Agent Scully falls in love, but that's obviously impossible. Agent Scully is already in love." Which I think is interesting because he doesn't say with Mulder or with anybody, like you said earlier, Marlene.
Yeah, but we know what he means.
We all know.
He could have turned back around and looked at Mulder and said, "With you, Agent Mulder." And
just to be clear about that, right?
Yeah.
Just to put
and not Mulder, too. Mulder is not in love. It's Scully that's in love.
Well, we don't get Mulder's reaction in that shot. We just get Scully's reaction.
I don't think that Paget cares whether or not Mulder is in love either.
No.
I mean, I don't think that he was... No. It's interesting, though, like, he seems to have some insight into Mulder, like, after the mail theft incident. But it's more like the insight into Mulder through Scully's behavior, but just all the things about... I think there's little parts in the episode that show that he has, obviously had to come to understand Mulder to a degree in his obsession with Scully.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the part about Agent Scully is already in love. I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think that they're sort of non-reaction. Like, they're not... I don't know. It's emotional, but it's not like, oh, goodness, and I don't know, anything that they're... Like, they're not changing expression, for example.
It's... Because it's not a moment... They don't play it... Again, all we have, the audience's eye is the eye of the camera. And the director and the writers, the producers, they decide where that camera's pointing. And so he says that line, and we are looking at Scully after that. We're not looking at Mulder. We're not looking at Scully and Mulder, kind of like looking at each other or avoiding each other's gaze. We get this close-up on Scully as that sinks in for her. And I think, like, the central, for me, like, especially at this point in the series, the central, like, ship question is, if these two characters are more than friends... What does that mean, and how much have they actually acknowledged that themselves? And for me, this is one of those moments where it's almost like the audience speaking through this character. You might as well be reading a transcript from like the AOL chat rooms of 1999, where it's like, well, Scully, you're clearly in love with your partner. Is that true? Is he right about that? Is he inferring something that isn't there? Is he inferring something that is not her being in love, but loving him as something else? I don't know. And I don't know that it's...
or is it like they're in a state of love together, but it's not like she's pining after him, or it's... or maybe in his head it is, because there's that piece of her that he's missing. Yeah, I don't know. It's
right. And it's a different question now in 2021, obviously, than it was in 1999, because we have foresight and we see where the relationship goes in the seasons after this. Which,
but at that time, I don't know that was part of a plan that they had. I think that they...
Listen, the X-Files was perfectly planned from the beginning.
Oh,
okay?
Please pardon me. Right?
It was all plotted out,
right,
beginning to end.
The narrative Bible that
absolutely.
Is the X-Files.
I mean, I think the X-Files is, when we want to talk about like real world parallels, like when Padgett says, like, I don't know how to end the book. It's like, well, okay, yeah, they're flying by the seat of their pants in the writer's room too, which is fine. But it does bring up these interesting questions, like when you do have two characters that are central to your show get together during the run of your show, and you do that off screen, which this show has the audacity to do, it does beg the question forever, when did this happen and how did it happen? And the X-Files is a weird show because, like, imagine if you were watching Friends and then suddenly, like, during an episode, it's like, oh, Rachel's having Ross's baby. It's like, wait, did they get together?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you show
Ross
that?
walks out of Rachel's room and half naked, and you're just like, wait, what?
Right,
really?
yeah. And, like, some people will be like, that's brilliant, and some people will be like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And,
rude.
Some people will just be like, why was the audience not privy to this? And, so it does, for me, it does color the show in moments like this, because we're just constantly sort of, I don't know, it's just like this sort of ambiguity throughout their relationship. And we know that it changes at some point, and we have a pretty good idea of what that change means and what it leads to. But all the details are really squishy. And maybe that's part of the reason why this show endures and that people keep going back, and why there are podcasts like this that analyze it, because there's just a lot of room for interpretation. And I think that this episode's like so, rife with that.
I guess to me, though, it's not that, because there's a level of intrigue for sure, but I think there's a level, like, to me, specifically with the X-Files, there's a level of it being sort of like a different or of a higher order, and there's something that's left out from Mulder and Scully because they're fictional, of all things. But
what?
Spoiler alert for the audience. They're not actually real people. But, I mean, if they were actual people, I think that, the story would probably not have, obviously, like, the turns that it has. But their relationship would probably be different. But I think Scully's, perhaps in this episode, thinking of something that's missing that isn't the thing that's missing, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
I do, yes.
It does.
Mulder.
And we're also, it's
that
tough.
Whole, like, the home and the family and the sex and all of that. And, like, again, like, if they were regular, like, normal, actual people, that would probably be a part of their lives at some point. But because of the way that they are and the story is, I don't see it as, like, oh, they're just, afraid to express their feeling. All of the kind of tropes of relationships that I think that you see in most other, like, movies and TV shows and what have you, I don't apply them to Mulder and Scully. I think that later on they got applied kind of in retrospect, but I don't see it as that type of thing in this episode. But I think that Scully is not really understanding what's there either, or maybe questioning it,
Yeah.
It's all very vague, but that's the thing. It's like,
I totally get what you're saying, and I think it's just hard. It's hard not to see it with hindsight, and it gets into that, what was the intent of the writer in that moment? Does the writer want us to think about, you know, what is the status of the relationship between Mulder and Scully, and Scully's feeling towards Mulder. And I think the answer has to be yes, but I guess it is open to interpretation as to what that actually means for the characters.
And what does
don't know.
Paget mean at that point, too? Like, why is he saying that?
Well, I see,
You know,
and
'cause then you get to the ending part when he, you know, like, which we have coming up at some point, but
yeah,
when his voice
Tomorrow.
When it's
We'll
like
get to that
the
tomorrow.
whole thing about having the heart of a destroyer, you know, and that his
Yeah.
ending in destroying himself, he kind of like gave them this chance to be freer, or sort of freed her, you know, and they had
Yeah.
what was it, like a chance to give what he could not receive. So
Yeah.
it's like they are in contrast to him, and like the whatever love story they have going on is in contrast, like in his imagined world, what he had for Scully. So
right.
is that a kind of like a prompt to that when he says Agent Scully is already in love, like when he's saying it out loud?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
That's a good question.
Yeah, and again, all we have is, you know, you can look at this episode from an historical perspective of, you know, everything that came before it and nothing that came after. Or you could, I mean, like, it's just so interesting, because in the very next episode, at the end of The Unnatural, we get maybe one of the most, you know, notable shipper moments
Right.
of the series, which is the batting practice moment. And,
Yeah.
you know, obviously, like, the final monologue of Milagro is not going to be like, you know, and then they would have the chance to swing the bat and hit the...
Oh my god! I think that would be my
like,
least
what
favorite
is he
episode.
talking about?
Literal. Yeah. Next, after that, Paget talks to his creation.
This is where the episode really leaves me sort of confused, because they track down who the stranger in the book is, this Ken doctor, and he's a real world person who was interested in this type of psychic surgery and sort of claimed to be the possessor of the skill, who immigrated to the United States a number of years ago, but who has been dead for 2 years. So maybe one of you can help me understand, like, so he's a real person, but he's dead, and he's also a character in Paget's book. What is the connection there between the character that appears in his mind in front of him and this real world person that actually existed but passed away? Any takers?
I assumed that it was that was just the, you know, inspiration, for lack of a better word, for the character. He's just writing this guy in the book based on that actual person. But there's no real... I'm not sure how he would have known of the actual person if they covered that.
Well, yeah, because there was no moment where they were like, you know, where he's like, oh, you came up in my research when I was...
Right.
You know, researching psychic surgery, and you were the, like, foremost name that came up.
Or like that Scully discovered that
Yeah.
Paget had been in Sao Paulo and came across this person in his travel, or whatever it was, and then wrote him in the
Right.
book. Yeah.
And I don't need every plot point to be spoon-fed to me, but that seemed like a strange sort of, like, dangling plot thread for me. Like, what is the connection between Paget and this deceased, you know, purveyor of psychic surgery? Like, how was he aware of him as a real world person, and that thus leading to him casting him as the antagonist in his book?
Well, he reads the personals and the ads in the newspaper, so I wonder if maybe he just at some point noticed an obituary
So
or an
reads the
article about
obituaries
him.
too. We missed the scene
Yeah,
of Mulder
or
reading the
something like
obituary
that.
section. They probably had to cut
Yeah.
that for time. And
Exactly.
that was like,
Low
The
budget.
40-minute
They didn't
obituary
have
section scene.
They didn't have the budget for the obituaries, just the personals, so they had to skip that page. Yeah,
That was just like a dangling thing for me. You
Yeah.
know, but if it is just sort of like, I mean, that creates such an interesting sort of concept too, because if he has the ability to basically recreate a real person from thin air, you know, what is it about Scully that makes her, you know, so, I guess, unattainable to him? I don't know. It's just, it's kind of a weird supernatural skill set You know what I mean?
As supernatural skill sets go, that is a different, kind of different.
So he has this conversation, and he says, like, Scully would be horrified by what you do, and he's like, I'm horrified by what I do. And he doesn't, the character is saying, like, I don't know why I do it.
Yes. Yeah.
And Paget's like, I don't know either. And it's like, how many times have I had that conversation with my character? And I'm like, why are you doing this? I don't know. It's like the thing about being a writer is you have to be the one to figure everything out. And if you write a character that's smarter than you are, you're in big trouble because you have to be the one to figure it all out eventually.
But in this situation, it begs the question, who is the killer? You know?
Right. And does it
If
matter?
neither of them know why it's happening.
Yeah.
That moment reminded me of the scene in Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose when the killer in the hotel room is asking Clyde Bruckman why he does the things he does and how they're horrible and so forth too. And it's like the whole thing is like he sees himself as a puppet because clearly Ken Nascimento does not think that he's responsible for what he's doing. You know, like he thinks that he's being directed, whereas it seems like Paget thinks that he's receiving this dictation on something that's happening.
Yeah, but, you know, he's not even a corporeal being, like, at the end of the day.
Right.
And as, you know, Bruckman tells the killer in his episode, you know, you do these things because you're a psychopath. Because you're crazy.
Homicidal maniac.
Right, you're a homicidal maniac. Oh, that makes sense.
And Mulder and Scully are just watching it, and they're like, so what's he up to now? He's just staring at the wall. Like, yeah.
Right, and he's having this heated discussion about, God and fate and murder. And
This is the part that makes me so uncomfortable because I have been there.
Yeah, but if this story was told today,
it'd
be like, you know, what's he doing now? He's on Twitter.
He's
just scrolling Twitter.
Scrolling Facebook, that's all.
Yeah, he's being very prolific on Twitter today, but he hasn't written a single word of his book. Crazy.
It's real. It's real, JJ. Stop looking at me like that.
Oh, it's so true.
No judgment. No judgment. It's part of the creative process. Right. But yeah, it's an interesting scene because it really, you know, where these people are dead. There's real people who have been killed in horrific ways. And who is responsible for this? And it's either this writer with supernatural abilities, you know, or it's a ghost. Yeah, it's not very clear cut.
And there's a whole thing too that Ken Nascimento goes into about how man imagines that he can express love as God would express love. So like the idea that Paget is trying to be God in his creation of these people and his expression of love for Scully or wanting to love her or whatever, and that the only power people have creatively is to destroy, which it's interesting that he, as a character that's very determined and, you know, his claim has no control over what he's doing. And in fact, it's not even an actual person, would have that perspective. And like what in Paget changed him to think that he does have some power of intervention to burn his manuscript. And of course, you know, pull out his heart.
Through destruction, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's the most Catholic thing I've ever heard. But
well, there's also, I mean, there's not a lot directly about Scully's Catholicism in this, but I mean, there are little, you know, inklings about it, I think, too.
Absolutely. It really, like, you know, the scene sets him up as, you know, Paget as like a truly tragic character. You know, he's basically been spending the entire episode writing his own death, and that goes back to that initial, you know, story index card. You know, there's only one way that this story was going to end, and, you know, in that scene, it's sort of like Agent Scully has to be murdered, but no, that's
perfect. Yeah,
it would be for it to be perfect, but you know, I hear that and I'm like, well, that's a pretty hack ending, actually.
It is.
But...
it is.
Yeah. But thankfully, that's not, you know, how the episode ended. That also would have been really tough for finishing the season if your main character's dead.
Arguably, though, isn't the perfect ending the fact that he dies?
Absolutely.
It is, but like, this idea of it being perfect, I think, like, a perfectly determined story, you know, with this tragic ending of destruction and all he can do is destroy, and he has this power now because he has had his character kill Scully. That's, like, perfect perfect in terms of like nothing else interfering with it, I would say. Whereas you have like all the imperfections and all the unexpected things that come in that, you know, result in this different ending that supposedly is the one true ending.
Yeah.
Although it's
so
interesting
meta.
too that Mulder stopping him from, you know, when he goes to chase him, he is interfering. Like he's almost unwittingly contributing to Scully's death because he's interfering with the intervention that's going on.
Yeah. And part of the reason for that, I think, is, you know, Mulder's jealousy of, you know, that he you know, it's interesting because Mulder's mind is usually so open to these, you know, sort of otherworldly supernatural concepts. And, you know, like if someone says, I have to, you know, the only way I can save her is to burn this manuscript because of the psychic connection and all the, and Mulder would usually be like, that makes sense to me. Go for it. I'll give you a police escort. But in this case, like, he is so pinned down to earth, and I think it is because of that jarring moment when he catches Scully on the bed with him. He just can't see past his distrust of this guy because of the position that he found him with Scully. And I don't mean that necessarily in a Mulder loves Scully sort of way, but I think that he, you know, Mulder does not like the idea, whether or not that's connected to any feelings he has. He does not like the concept of Scully being with him, or maybe even being with anyone, because it doesn't fit into his, you know, worldview and the dynamic that he's created with this person, who's the most important person in his life.
Right. And there's several times when he's talking about, especially in, I think it's the second jail scene, when it's like he has to believe one thing in order for the other thing to be true. Like he can't believe that Paget is just imagining what happens with the killings, because if he's imagining that and it's coming true, because if he's imagining that, then what he's imagining about Scully must then necessarily be true. Like I feel like Mulder has that kind of very overly logical, deterministic way of thinking that's not his usual Mulder way, that he's kind of shoehorned himself into this because, like you said, like because of what's going on with her and what he wants to believe about her.
Yeah, it really, it gets to him. It affects his work in a way that we don't often see, which is, again, this is it's an interesting episode in the dynamics that it creates. It's not your typical episode of the X-Files. At the end, you know, when they're in the basement and he's trying to destroy the manuscript, is when we see Scully being attacked, right? Upstairs, and Mulder hears the gunshots. And for me, this is, I don't know if this should be a segment on the X-Cast or not, but, you know, it's like one of those moments where it's like Scully goes through this thing, and it's just like, Scully, how do you not believe? Like, you just fired like your entire clip through this guy's body, and it hit the wall behind him as he was reaching into your chest.
See her kind of looking, I think, or at least like for a split second, it looks like she's noticing that the bullets are hitting the wall rather than going at him.
Right.
Yeah.
You know?
While he is reaching his hand into her chest, not leaving a mark. Yeah. It's
blood
super
everywhere,
creepy.
like actual blood everywhere.
Yeah. Like
You
she
know.
lost quite a bit of blood, and there was no mark. Yeah, it's just one of those moments where, you know, I guess technically there's no clear evidence of a supernatural occurrence other than the blood on her chest. But yeah, it's just like, how are you explaining this one away?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's X-Files for you. That's all
Yeah,
for
that's
the
X-Files
But
fan
it's
thing,
like her
right?
collapse at the end. It's like all of those things, I think, have just backed
Yeah.
up on her.
Yeah.
And when Mulder runs upstairs, like we talked a lot about Gillian Anderson, it's clearly like, I don't want to say like, I don't want to say like it's just one person's episode, but if you had to, I mean, it's her episode. But I would say that when he is like running down the hallway and opens the door and sees her, and just like that startle, I thought David Duchovny did a really good job with that part, just like that nervousness. Like you could almost, you don't see him buckle, but you kind of feel like his legs are going to buckle at some point in that.
Yeah.
I thought he did
It
a
was
really good job.
it was understated too.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought made it more effective.
Right, like I could see Duchovny, like, you know, there's that moment where he slowly crouches down beside her, her body, and he doesn't realize she's alive until that, you know, sudden jerk. And you know, some actors might have devolved into ugly crying before that jerk took place, but it was very understated. He was just sort of shocked and didn't know how to react. And, you wonder what's going through Mulder's head at that moment, especially given the circumstances surrounding, what occurred and, kind of the terms that he and Scully had been on that day with everything that was going on.
Yeah, I especially like the look on his face when, she grabs him and he holds her, and then she starts to cry, and then it shows his face, and he just sort of melts with her, too.
Very empathic.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a great moment.
We never get anything after that from them. That's the last time we see them in the episode. And all we get is that tracking shot in the basement from the burned manuscript to Paget's body on the ground holding his own heart. And, watching that and, watching it fade out at that moment, I do wonder, when ultimately Scully and Mulder get up off of the floor and they go back down to the basement and they find him, where does that leave Scully? Like, what's Scully's reaction to this strange guy who, was just a part of her life for over the course of a couple of days, but is now gone? I mean, it's just one of those things. I'm glad the episode ended there. I mean, that's where the story ends.
Perfect ending.
But, you do wonder, since the nature of episodic television, you live with these characters week to week, even though their stories end, at the end of each episode. But, how does this affect her moving forward? And that's one of the things in this era of episodic television where you don't really get to examine that, If something like that would have happened on a modern television show, the first scene of the next episode would have been like, man, can you believe that guy pulled his heart out of his chest?
Or she'd be like in therapy or something, talking about it and processing, and
Right.
She just turns to her to fruity rice dreamsicles.
But to me, it's more, because it's.
I
such
smell a
interior...
fanfic.
Because it is like so much her interior life and like what you can and can't see of that. I think that's. I wonder more about this episode than I do about some episodes that would just be like, oh, what happens next? Like, oh, well, I can do without having, like every plot point that may have happened next explained to me. I can, if I want to make up some sort of, like intercessory moment, I can do that. But with this, because it's what's inside her head, it's more compelling to me. Like, well, how did she process this? Like, what did happen next for her? What does she think?
Right. What happened next is she gets some batting practice in.
Right.
And and here's a charming tale of 1947 Roswell, New Mexico.
She went to the mailbag to see what the viewers had to say.
Oh, transition!
We have a mix. We've got some really short comments and some longer comments. So it was a nice mix. And it seems like everybody really had some good things to say about this episode, which is really interesting considering that it's a little bit lower on the IMDb scale. But obviously IMDb is not really a good judge of how we all view the X-Files.
I think this is an episode for fans, if that makes any sense.
I agree. Like, I do too. Yeah, I do too. It's different.
All right, Joy says, it does not set my heart on fire, but her screams at the ends send chills through my whole body, which I agree with. I don't like to see Scully, in trouble. AJ Black says, it's both pretentious nonsense, a spark of brilliance, completely self-absorbed Tosh, and knowingly smart and cynical about authorship and obsession. It's a huge stew, and I completely love it. I see the surrealism of Lynch in the intense self-destructive romantic brooding of Matthew Weiner's Mad Men, giving Milagro both inspirations and subsequent texts that it may have influenced. I feel like Milagro is one of those X-Files that works on numerous levels of analysis. It also starkly marks out the difference between both halves of Season 6, with the first being comedic and experimental and the latter being both traditional, comedic, and surrealist at the same time.
Talk about a writer.
Yeah. AJ doesn't know how to write, no. Tony, nah, he's not a writer. He doesn't write a lot. Carl Neer says, it didn't exactly set my heart on fire the first time it aired, but I've really come to enjoy it over the years. And also, when I posted in the mailbag, I asked, does this set your heart on fire?
I was going to say, a lot of people.
That's where we get that, yes.
People.
These people are saying the same thing. No, yes. That's what I was like, does Milagro set your heart on fire, or what do you think? And apparently a lot of people answered that directly, so it works. And then, let's see, Eleanor says, I like this episode, but it's both boring and uncomfortable at the same time. Lengthy voiceovers are not my favorite part of the show, but I like the read that Paget's dull and creepy descriptions are tongue-in-cheek for how Chris Carter views Scully. There's something unsettling about the strength of the male gaze here and how it breaks Scully at the end. It's unlike any other episode of the show, and every time I watch it, I'm 30% bored and 70% into it.
Bored?
That's
really?
an interesting take.
That's interesting. Because I find, like, every time I'm on the edge of my seat, as though I don't know what's going to happen next, like, staring, and almost with, like, drool coming out. I'm just, like, so fixated on it
really,
through
really
every
intense.
moment. But,
I don't know. Could have used a couple car chases.
yeah, right. Keep out that high action level.
Yeah. Michael Little says, a fascinating peek into Chris Carter's twisted psyche, albeit very problematic. Still, a fascinating watch for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the problematic nature of it, and again, like, you know, 2021, you know, the way that we view things like, you know, sexual harassment and, you know, just stalking and, you know, with the Me Too movement, for me, it puts this episode in a slightly different light, where I think, you know, in 1999, in the prevalence of mainstream culture, you know, you see this guy's actions and they might not seem as alarming. But I don't think you can really watch it the same way today, even with the performance that is given. I do think that the episode, especially for younger, newer viewers, it's going to play differently than it would have back then. I agree with that.
I don't think it's supposed to. I mean, it's not. And I mean, I don't like to see everything. Well, really anything from like a social lens usually. But I don't think it's a recommendation of that type of behavior. You know, it's a type of person that behaves that way, and that person could exist today as well as they did. Yeah, 1999. Yeah. So I don't think that they're condoning it by having. You know, I don't know.
It's, you know what, this is a question that's
like,
so.
I would think of that more now, but I don't think in the telling of the story that has to be changed because we see the things differently.
I agree. Yeah, I don't think it invalidates, you know, the existence of the episode or the way the story is told, but I do think that some people will have different, stronger reactions to some of the actions, the way that it plays out generally. But I mean, like that concept, the idea of, you know, creation versus creator. I mean, it's ironic because it's so central to the episode itself. You know, the idea: are you responsible for the life that the things that you create take on? Quite literally in Milagro, but then, you know, I guess, you know, when it comes to what we're talking about here, it's, you know, it's still relevant, but not in a, you know, this episode is not going to reach into your chest and pull out your heart, which is, you know, probably a good thing.
Cortland says, this is consistently one of my favorite episodes of the show for a few reasons. I really enjoy the more subtle, creepy tension of this plot and story, and I think it's fascinating to see Scully, a powerful female character we're accustomed to seeing, handle much more imminent threats, deal with a different but very familiar kind of threat. Additionally, the commentary the episode provides about a writer's obsession with his character also never fails to make me consider my own obsession with these characters in particular. And finally, this is a beautiful episode to watch as they've obviously taken great pains with some of the lighting and stylistic camera shots and angles. Yeah. We didn't get much into the fans' obsession with the show and the interpretation with that, did we?
No, but you mentioned obsession at the start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, the show plays around with that a couple of different times, you know, with, you know, fan obsession with Mulder and Scully and everything. What's the name of the junior agent who idolizes Mulder and Scully?
That Harrison, Layla Harrison. Is that it? Later
right.
on? Yeah.
Yes. And she pops up in Alone in season 8, and she's matched up with Doggett, and then isn't she in another one too?
She's in one of the season 9 episodes, I think, as well.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of, season 9 episode. Anyway, you know, the idea of like literally like bringing in a fan of Mulder and Scully into the narrative and sort of playing with that idea of there being fans of these agents in their real world.
Yeah, we had some really good comments on this. Definitely go check those out in our mailbag section for under Milagro in our Xcast X-Files Basement fan group. But I think we've pretty much covered everything on this
I think we could
episode.
have a spin-off podcast of the Xcast,
Yeah.
like Milagro Cast, possibly.
I think
Yes.
definitely.
We just do like 1 minute of each episode. We do a minute of the episode.
Yeah, like
over
Yeah.
the course of
minute. I like
an
that.
hour and a half.
Milagro Minute.
Oh, it's got
Yeah.
that alliteration. Perfect.
So, let's see. JJ, where can we find you online?
You can find me on my website at jjlendl.com. That's jjlendl.com. I'm also on social media. I'm at JJ Lendl on Twitter and on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/JJ Lendl Art Studio. You can find me on Tumblr, which I still do update from time to time at X-Files Poster Project. And something else that I launched this year is a Patreon. So if folks are interested in supporting my work in a more direct way, you can go to patreon.com/JJLendl, and there are a number of tiers available. You could pledge as little as $1 per month, and you can get access to exclusive digital content. There are other newly launched tiers as of the recording of this episode, where you can actually get some physical benefits on a monthly basis, including postcards, bi-monthly zines, which feature some of my episode art, and even hand-drawn commissions. So you can check that out at patreon.com/JJLendl.
Yes.
Like, you're
I
gonna
saw
send
some
us
of the
a postcard?
postcards. Yeah, I saw some on Instagram the
Sounds
other
awesome.
day. They look really cool. Yes. Aren't they gorgeous?
Oh, I was thinking like
Yes.
it's a postcard,
Yeah.
like you're going to go on a trip, like you and your wife are on a trip, and it's like you're going to send a postcard.
I'll send you a postcard. No, so
I'm in
I
Dominican, working on my X-Files poster.
there you go.
Wish you were here.
Hope to see you
Weather's great.
soon.
Yeah.
Well, we never go anywhere anymore, so it'd be pretty boring. So the plan is that every month I'll either design a new image from scratch, or I'll use one of my older designs, and not just X-Files stuff. You know, I have a lot of stuff from other genre shows and pieces of pop culture. So yeah, one of the tiers, you'll get basically a thank you postcard every month for the support. And something that I'm just launching next month is the zine, which I'm really excited about. Which is just like a short magazine that features some of my artwork. And again, these are all as gifts. None of this stuff is for sale, because a lot of the artwork in it it's fan art. But just as like a thank you to folks who are into my stuff and just want to sort of to donate to my work in a direct way.
It's really cool. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Marlene, where can we find you?
Right now, I would say I'm on Facebook in the Xcast Basement group, Marlene Stemmy.
Awesome.
That's it.
And as all
I know, I got oh my
No,
gosh.
you can take over that's my social media contribution at this particular time. That's the thing right now. So
I wish. I it's my favorite part about social media is being able to interact with people who I have similar, interests with, and who are into my work, which is really great. But like, when you want to be a professional artist now, it's just like, oh, by the way, you can't just make the art. You also have to promote it, and you have to, be online and make sure that your stuff is, accessible and communicating all this stuff. So it's like a whole other job. And, I'm not at a point where I can hire a social media manager. So it's all me.
Yep. You can also find me on Twitter promoting my stuff, my books.
Tell us about your books.
you're a writer,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Tell us about your
Who knew? It's not like I ever talk about it at all. Yeah, I have 2 books in the Tides of Darkness series, Darkness Shifting and Darkness Loves Company. So it's a lot of fun. If you like X-Files, you definitely like those books. It's about a paranormal investigator in New York City, Sydney Lake. She's got red hair. Amazing coincidence.
Yeah, but how many psychic surgeries happen in your books? That's my question.
None yet.
Oh, all right.
Yep.
Book 3.
Maybe. Never know. Could happen. Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Sarah L. Blair, and I'm on Instagram at author.sarah.blair. And you can also find the Xcast on Twitter at the X_cast. And like I mentioned before, the Facebook group, and on Instagram, the Xcast Pod. So, we were looking forward to seeing y'all around to talk more about the X-Files and more about Milagro. Maybe we'll make Milagro Minute happen, because that's a fun idea.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be our summer project, our summer side project.
Let's pick a really, really average or below average episode and do it with that. Let's do like the
Fearful
Alpha
Symmetry.
Minute. Yeah, Fearful Symmetry Minute. Space Minute. Podcast canceled halfway through first episode.
Did not go to series.
Right.
All right, guys. We will see you around. And until next time, always remember, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Podcast 616, a Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast.
I don't think an episode will end with, my name is Agatha Harkness, and we're supposed to be like, oh my god,
right.
Because if you haven't read anything outside the films, you'd be like, who the hell is that?
Yeah.
It's like in that film I constantly like to give a kick in Star Trek Into Darkness, where Cumberbatch goes, my name is Khan, and then there's a pause.
Yeah.
And I imagine at least half the audience are going to be watching it and be like, who the hell is Khan? I have no idea who this is. So if they try and pull that with Agatha Harkness, which I don't think they will, it will get the same reaction.
Pick a disc.
It definitely fits like I think this is a danger zone in a few ways for Teen Girl, where we try to write songs that sound like a band from the 90s that we like, and this one is just like it was our attempt at like kind of a slacker rock thing, and I still like it, but I don't think it ever fit with us live. It never quite hit the right vibe live. I still like it on the album, but yeah, that one's that was a lot of fun because we brought in our buddy Alex to play guitar on the noise part in the middle, which I really loved. And he actually did some really cool slide guitar for Snow Cones that we kept off because we liked it as a simpler song.
The Time Is Now, a Millennium podcast.
And I do like that this is thrown in for something that is quite millenniumistic.
I refrained from saying that before I said it, but I was like, I'll let you go.
I couldn't help myself.
Yeah.
But I think it fits well with the whole Y2K element. So literally entering a dark age. So if all our technology were to fail today, you can see, given how much data is how much of all the data that sums up who we are and the age that we're living through is held digitally. Yeah, it would lead to a dark age. So I think it's very effective to talk about the dark ages and introduce a text like that in the context of this episode.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.